Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Today we'll be discussing the provocative book by Harvard professor Robert Mnookin. It's called The Jewish American Paradox: Embracing Choice in a Changing World. Mnookin takes on the complex history and debates around defining Jewish identity, and he proposes that each of us should be the author of our own Jewish authenticity. Professor Mnookin is the Samuel Williston Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. For 25 years, he served as the chair of the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School, and he directs the Harvard Negotiation Research Project. He is a leading scholar in the field of conflict resolution, and he's written or edited 10 books and numerous scholarly articles. Two of his other books include Kissinger, the Negotiator, and Bargaining with the Devil: When to Negotiate, When to Fight. Welcome to the broadcast, Robert Mnookin.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So let's just start with the elevator pitch for the book. When you sit around with your friends and relatives and they say, "What's this book about, Robert?" What do you tell them?
Well, the book is about Jewish identity, and it really arises out of my own struggle and issues relating to my own identity. What I hope to do in the book is make an argument for a broad, very inclusive Jewish community. And I try to identify what I see are the central challenges facing the American Jewish community.
And before we get to those challenges, I'm going to push you a little. There are a number of people who have written about Jewish identity, and particularly kind of in the last 3 or 4 years when we've really seen it be sort of at an inflection point. What do you say about how your book is new? Like, what do you feel like you did that hasn't been done?
Well, I think that what I end up proposing is for the Jewish community as a whole, a big tent approach in which, as you suggested in your introduction, individuals who choose to self-identify would be welcomed under the big tent of the Jewish community as a whole. In other words, I reject for the big tent the traditional matrilineal approach. And what I'm suggesting is even broader than what the Reform or Reconstruction movements do today, because I would not require formal religious conversion. What I would require is public self-identification. Now, under the big tent, one thing that I think so glorious in the United States is we have an extraordinary variety of Jewish institutions, some philanthropic, some religious, some political, all sorts, some artistic. I believe that those particular institutions can have whatever entrance requirements they want in terms of who counts as Jewish. In other words, I'm not telling the Orthodox community that they have to adopt my big tent standard for their own synagogue. What I'm saying is this should be the standard for the community as a whole. I think such a two-pronged approach makes a lot of sense given the complexities we face in America. And I think that is something new. Indeed, that's something that the New York Times in its editorial said was revolutionary, quote, some would say heretical revision.
That was about your book?
Yes.
When the Times wrote about that? And what is the two-pronged approach you mentioned?
Well, the two-pronged approach is that first, for the community as a whole, that we have a big tent that's very welcoming, where public self-identification, in other words, someone saying, I consider myself a Jew, is good enough for entrance. There's no inquiry about who is your mother, who is your father, have you had a formal conversion. But the second prong is under the big tent, there are all these institutions that I described, various kinds of religious institutions, et cetera, philanthropic, artistic. Those individual organizations, the second prong, I believe, is they get to define for themselves what's required for membership. And so if the Orthodox want to stick with matrilineal descent or a very strict form of religious conversion, that's fine. That's up to them. But they don't get to define it for the big tent.
I'm sure, Robert, you can hear the critics in your head, those who are saying or would say that you're watering down Jewish identity to kind of be whatever anybody says they want it to be, that there's kind of no glue based on, put halacha aside, doing Jewish things, signing on to a certain kind of Jewish commitment, a sense of what's bound our people together for centuries. What's going to bind us now if everyone's kind of defining it for themselves?
Well, I think that if you look at America today, within the Jewish community, there's no single sense at all of what the purpose or goal is. People are defining it for themselves now. I mean, for example, Pew suggests that, and we can talk more about this later.
You mean the Pew Research Center?
The Pew Research Center, which has done the best survey work on American Jews. They discovered that about a quarter of American Jews don't believe in a personal God at all, and another quarter are kind of agnostic. So that means half of the Jews in America really have a fairly tenuous tie to the religious aspects of Judaism. Indeed, as you know, I think the proportion who belong to a temple or synagogue is about a third. 2/3 aren't affiliated. So I mean, the notion that in America today, there's sort of some minimum set of requirements, other than you've got to be born into it or have a formal conversion, there aren't such a thing. And I think, it would be one thing, if we Jews had a pope, or we had a catechism that was required in order to call yourself a Jew. That'd be one thing. We don't have that today. And therefore, I acknowledge that, in fact, under my standard, some people might be under the big tent with very thin Jewish identities, where it doesn't much affect how they're living their daily lives. But my response would be, well, that's true today, and they're still included. And I think that, in fact, I might prefer a world where people had a more substantial commitment to express their Judaism in their daily lives. Judaism, not necessarily in the sense of a religious way, but at least in a cultural and ethical way. But we don't have that. And we don't have a pope to define it.
And it's interesting that you're talking about thin Judaism, because you described yourself as sort of starting with a thinner brand of Judaism, and that you really, at least to my eyes, reading this, have thickened your Judaism quite substantially in the process of reporting this book and writing this book. Can you just talk personally about sort of your personal arc there?
I think that's completely fair. I grew up, I was born in Kansas City, Missouri. Both my parents were born in Kansas City, Missouri, and I grew up with 4 grandparents in Kansas City. So, and being from Kansas City is an important part of my identity. My family had been longtime members of the Reform community. In the Midwest in the 50s, everybody had to belong. I mean, whether you were a Catholic, a Protestant, or a Jew, Will Herberg wrote a wonderful book about this, but for social identification purposes, you had to belong to something. And we belonged to a Reform temple that was at the high water mark. I grew up at the high water mark of what's called classical Reform. What did that involve? Well, we of course we did have services on Friday night and Saturdays, but of course, my family never went. We went to High Holy Day services. We celebrated Hanukkah as well as Christmas. We celebrated Passover, was a big deal. And my religious education consisted of going to Sunday school on Sundays and being confirmed when I was about 15. There were no bar or bat mitzvahs in our Reform congregation. In fact, there was a great controversy around the time I was 15 or 16, whether they'd start having them. And at the outset at Temple B'nai Yehuda, which was, by the way, formed in the 1870s, it's a rather old Reform congregation, they called it initially Reader of the Torah. They didn't call it a bar mitzvah. Anyway, so my own Jewish education was trivial. Although I certainly identified as a Jew.
And you also, and I think in an interview or in the book, you say you grew up with a bedrock sense of what was owed, that tikkun olam was very much, call it a religion or not, integral.
You're 100% right. And I think this is something, classical reform today is ridiculed because even the reform movement has, of course, has much more liturgy, much more Hebrew. We had very little Hebrew. And I never learned Hebrew, unfortunately. But I'll tell you one thing that was hammered into our heads, and that was tikkun olam and our notion of we had to make a social contribution as Jews. That was part of our Jewish identity, to help heal the world. And I think, in fact, in people's ridicule of classical reform, that's often overlooked. And indeed, both my grandparents and parents were very involved in philanthropy, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And there was never any denial of whether you were a Jew or not. It was just, I sort of grew up believing that being Jewish was part of who I was. It was a modest inconvenience in some ways because I went to a private boys' school that I knew had a quota. I knew that we belonged to a Jewish country club, but there was no way our family was going to be able to join the Kansas City Country Club, which was our Mission Hills. So I never really personally faced any individual anti-Semitism, but I was quite aware that, in terms of
you were outsiders of a certain.
We were, to a degree, outsiders, and particularly among the upper middle class circles in which my parents and family lived, you were made aware of the distinction.
So when you also, I guess, in the process of writing this book, kind of came to some of your own regrets as a parent, and one thing you cite is that you wish that you had introduced some rituals with your kids. Absolutely. That you kind of couldn't make up for lost time once they were grown. So just talk a little bit about, even though you're basically saying that we can decide what kind of Jew to be.
Yes.
You're kind of recommending not to disregard how powerful these rituals can be, these traditions can be.
No, I would even get rid of the word kinda. I think you're 100% right. And my own regret is that I don't feel much of an emotional connection to most of the rituals. And I think in part is because perhaps of their absence in my childhood. I tell a story that at the beginning of my book of during our first sabbatical was in Oxford, England. And my daughter.
You mean your sabbatical, just want to be clear, as a professor?
As a professor, yes. Okay. At the time, I began my academic career as a professor at Berkeley. And I had a sabbatical and we took it at Oxford. And we lived in North Oxford for a term. And we enrolled our daughters in English schools. And my older daughter, Jennifer, who's was then 11, so this was a long time ago. The first week at dinner, we'd always ask the kids, well, what did you do today? What did you learn today? And she said, well, we had our first class in RE. And I said, well, what's RE? She said, religious education. Now, her school was called the Oxford High School for Girls. It was a private school. And she went on to tell us that RE, religious education, was taught by the headmistress, the formidable Ms. K. And she began this class by asking, who here is an Anglican? And Jennifer reported that almost all the kids raised their hands. And she then asked, well, is there anyone here who's a Presbyterian? And a few more raised their hands. Catholic, maybe one more. Then she ends up at some point saying, is there anyone here not of the Christian faith? And I said to Jennifer, well, what did you do? And Jennifer said, I raised my hand. And Miss K asked me, what are you, my dear? And I said, I'm Jewish. And Miss K said, oh, how interesting. And then she asked whether my parents would object if in RE We read both elements in the New Testament and the Old Testament, and Jennifer reported, my parents let me read anything I want. So we said to Jennifer, well, Jennifer, I think you responded quite appropriately. How do you feel about all this? And she looked at my wife and me, and she said, when are we going to become Jewish? And I said, slightly embarrassed, well, Jennifer, your mother and I have always thought of ourselves as Jewish. We're not affiliated with a temple now, but we are Jewish. And, what I sort of reported to Jennifer is being Jewish is not something you choose or have to become. You just are. And she says, you know what I mean. And I said, no, I don't know what you mean. And she said, out of the blue, she said, she's 11. She says, I want to be bat mitzvahed. Mm. And Dale and I were a little taken aback because neither she nor I, Dale grew up in a similar St. Louis family that belonged to a classic Reformed congregation. So neither of us had ever been bar and bat mitzvahed. And although our parents always had affiliated, this was the 70s. And as children of the 60s, there was no need to affiliate. And we were living in Berkeley. God knows you didn't have to affiliate with a religion in Berkeley. In all events, although I didn't realize it at the time, Jennifer really posed the question that in many ways is at the heart of my book. Mm. And that is, should Jewish be something you simply are by descent? Or should it involve a choice of some sort?
I love that you at one point in your book say that instead of thinking of ourselves as the chosen people, we should be the choosing people. And the idea that each one of us essentially is making that choice, no matter how we're born.
You've captured the essence of the book. And that is what I think that all of us, including those of us who view ourselves as Jews by birth, really have to choose how we're going to express that in our lives. I would much rather it be a more active form of Judaism.
But just in Isaiah, I think it says, and a child will lead them. So Jennifer basically chose to go through a bat mitzvah. You put her in Hebrew school. Is that what happened?
We joined a Reformed temple in Berkeley when we got back, and Jennifer, she in fact was bat mitzvah. She was, as it turns out, she's quite a good student, and she got
good DNA.
Well, no, I think she deserves some credit herself. But she was bat mitzvah when she was 13, and our younger daughter Allison, by the way, at the time was 8. And she said, because of this conversation, she said, I'm the only American kid in my class too, and I'm probably the only Jewish kid, but no one's asked and I haven't said anything. Mm. I thought, in fact, the responses of my two daughters perfectly triangulated my growing up in an assimilated family in Kansas City. If anyone made an issue of it, I was going to raise my hand. But if they didn't, I was going to fit in.
So you say that you write this book is a plea for tolerance. And you say that we should be embracing everyone who wants to join us, not spending time deciding who counts. What's the danger of having some kind of gatekeepers on deciding?
Well, as I say, what for individual institutions, if Orthodox synagogues want to erect barriers for themselves, that's fine. If the conservative movement wants to continue to struggle with whether rabbis can or cannot even attend a marriage service involving an intermarriage, that's up to them. I don't want to impose my own very liberal view on them for their particular institutions. But on the other hand, for the community as a whole, I think it's terribly important that we be more accepting. And in fact, many of our institutions are quite accepting. I mean, Jewish community centers most of them don't quiz people on how much of a Jew are you.
Right.
And I think that's fine.
So I just want to give some of the chapter headings so people know what's in this book. You trace the matrilineal principle,
Yes.
take a real deep dive into that history. You say, must a Jew practice Judaism? The puzzle of Jewish blood. You talk about that discussion of Jews as a race, which has been so problematic. Peoplehood. Who is a Jew in Israel? Very active now as you and I are speaking. Who is a Jew in America? I want to go to the next one. Can we survive acceptance?
Yes.
Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, I think that, in fact, the paradox, or one of the paradoxes that underlies the book, is that in the 2,000-year diaspora, in my view, there's never been a place like America. And that today, to a stunning degree, more, I believe, than most anywhere in the world, at least with a substantial Jewish community, Jews are very widely accepted. Institutionalized discrimination is a thing of the past. And what is stunning, as I studied it, in our parents' and grandparents' generation, there was substantial institutionalized discrimination. There were quotas in schools. There were residential areas that were restricted. There were employment domains where Jews couldn't get jobs. All of that has gone by the boards. And indeed, what's really interesting, and most American Jews don't realize this, there was a study, I think once again done by Pew, where they quizzed a broad cross-section of Americans about their admiration or not for different religions. And guess which religion turned out to be the most admired? Judaism. I mean, that's just sort of stunning, okay? Now, I'm not saying there are no anti-Semites in America. No one could have lived through the last few years and believe that. But I think
you're separating out the discrimination that's institutionalized, not getting jobs, not necessarily being admitted to clubs or being able to rent an apartment.
That's right.
Obviously not denying that anti-Semitism has spiked significantly in the last few years. And so you're talking, when you say, can we survive acceptance? I just want to understand, you mean if our identity, in a sense, coalesced around Jew hatred,
yes,
we can't use that as an organizing principle the same way anymore.
That's exactly right. And my own study of American history, and this will surprise people, the worst period in terms of American anti-Semitism was between 1900 and 1945, roughly. And so this change is comparatively recent. And I think the issue...
Sorry, which change? The change with less discrimination.
Acceptance and the disappearance of institutionalized discrimination. For my children and grandchildren, and for yours too, I do not think they, in terms of how they live their lives, will face any kind of significant discrimination because they're Jewish. If they want to identify as a Jew, it's not going to, quote, cost them.
Let's hope you're right. Let's hope you're right.
No, I understand. And that's my own view. And I may, like a lot of other things, I may not be right about it. But I think the challenge, frankly, and well, by the way, the degree of intermarriage, of course, is a powerful reflection of that acceptance. Because in previous times, obviously, within our religion and within our community, there were substantial pressures not to intermarry, but there also were substantial pressures within the Gentile community not to have your children marry Jews. And so, in fact, the extent to which they're now, intermarriage is, I view it as almost the norm. It's not the exception. If you put aside the Orthodox, a majority of Jews who marry now are marrying non-Jewish spouses. And I think that too reflects this stunning acceptance. And so I think the question is, with this change in terms of anti-Semitism and with this broad acceptance, will we have the capacity to survive as such a diverse and vibrant community? Now, I'm not saying there's a risk that Jews are going to vanish. There are two groups that for sure in 50 years are going to, I think, still be probably quite vibrant. A, those who are deeply religious, especially the Orthodox, and B, the most fervent Zionists who remain in the United States. They're going to still have solid identification.
I know it's a big subject, but you do talk about Israel and how that is a touchstone of identity. Can you we're speaking at a time, obviously, where there's a lot of turmoil.
It sure is.
So how can you just unpack that in a few sentences? I know it deserves more.
Well, I think that, ironically, during most of the 75 years since Israel was formed, Israel has been a source of support for American Jewish identity because there was an extremely broad consensus that we wanted Israel to survive and we wanted it to prosper, and we took pride in it. I think today, if you ask most rabbis, American rabbis, Israel is a source of deep divisions. And for rabbis in America today, to give sermons relating to Israel, it's sometimes like the third rail.
It's perilous.
Perilous. And it's perilous because for many of us, and I count myself in this, there are certain policies of the Israeli government that we find deeply offensive. And we find it inconsistent with what we consider our Jewish values as American Jews.
So I just want to end, Robert, by just talking about sort of why now for this book, because it's not necessarily intuitive that a professor who's expert in conflict resolution, has taught at Harvard for so long, decides to take on Jewish identity for a book subject. And you write about how it was kind of a very personal reckoning when you realized you cared that your grandchildren know that they're Jewish and actually feel connected to Jewish identity. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? Why did you decide to do this now?
Well, that you put your finger on it. I asked myself, why? Because I had everything to learn in order to write this book. I loved the process because I've always enjoyed being a student, but I also struggled with it. And I asked myself, why are you doing this? And it's because I wanted to explore what were the roots of my caring now when I'm an old guy, that my grandchildren, and someday perhaps their children, still identify and take pride in their Jewish heritage. And why, for someone who is not religiously committed, what this was all about. And I'm optimistic. I think what's so stunning in America today, for example, is the number of families where intermarried families where the non-Jewish spouse hasn't converted, but where that spouse is actively participating in raising Jewish children. I think that's simply fantastic. And I think those spouses, by the way, ought to be recognized as really part of the American Jewish community. They are, even though they haven't very few of them formally converted. So I think there are grounds for optimism, but there are also grounds for concern, because for Jews in America today, many of us generally We know very little about our heritage. I'm appalled by how little people know about American Jewish history, apart from the history of the Jews generally. And although I'm not religious, I think our religious history is just extraordinarily interesting and important. So anyhow, this is how I expressed my Jewish spark, I guess.
Yes. And I love that in the acknowledgments, you talk about a colleague, I think at Harvard, who said, of course, writing this book is hard. You are working out your own mishigas. And each one of us has our own mishigas. I'm glad that you've done this on the page. And I encourage people to buy this book and engage these conversations. Once again, it's called The Jewish American Paradox, Embracing Change in a Changing World. Professor Robert Mnookin, thank you for being with us on In the Spotlight.
Thank you so much.
And to everyone watching, I'll see you next time.